Okay, finishing this last part of the second PowerPoint of PowerPoint 1B, actually, and trying to get into the period from 1876 into 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. One of the important themes of Reconstruction is that African Americans did organize into a series of of, of, of of clubs and candidates who actually attempted to run for office. And one of the things, of course, is that this was a novelty. African Americans had never been represented in government, going back to the earliest times of the history of European and African presence in North America, going back to the earliest colonial times in the 17th century. So by the time we get to about 1876, just a couple of details here. There were about 600 African Americans who served in state legislatures as state legislators in legislatures. They served as mayors and judges and sheriffs. There were almost all of them were Republicans, radical Republicans. There actually were two African American men who served in the Senate, and 14 men served in the House of Representatives and Congress. And so there was significant involvement and investment by African American men. Remember, African American women could not vote, neither could white women at this point. And so while there was, pretty extensive settlement and engagement by African American men into political office, the highest levels, though, continued to be held by white Republicans and white Republican allies of these African American, more radical Republicans. And that was going to continue till the end of Reconstruction, pretty much. Let's talk now on this very last PowerPoint bullet point here on this slide of the PowerPoint, and talk about two terms that I want you to be familiar with. One is the scalawag or scalawags, and the second is the carpetbaggers. And these are both terms that come out of Reconstruction. They're historical terms that describe actual historical people who lived. Scalawags, which is the term is there for you right there, right? These were people who were native white Southerners, and they were people who typically had opposed secession. They did not want the South to succeed. And in the period of time after the Civil War, in the Reconstruction time, they were very sympathetic to the hopes and interests of the Republicans and of the aims of the North in reconstructing the South. And so they were just absolutely loathed, absolutely hated by the majority of Southerners who felt like these new Republican political leaders and the radical Republicans and the U.S. government and the U.S. military were imposing their will all over the South during this period of Reconstruction. And so scalawag, if you were accused of being a scalawag, of being sympathetic and supporting the Union side and the Unionists and the hopes of particularly of the Republicans during Reconstruction, you were seen as a form of a traitor. It was used as a form of derision, that you were scalawag. Just the term itself sounds like a negative term, the way that it gets created. And so scalawags were people who were seen as, or who were accused of being sympathetic to the Unionists, to the federal government, to the hopes and aims of Republicans, particularly radical Republicans, and it was often used as a term of derision during this period of Reconstruction, particularly in the 1860s and 1870s, by other white Southerners who were unhappy with these people who they thought were being sympathetic to the aims of the Union and of the military and of that presence of Republicans in Southern government. Okay, that's the term scalawag. Second term is carpetbaggers, and as you can probably expect, these were people that were described largely by former Confederates, by Southerners, white Southerners, as people from the North, as Northerners who packed all of their belongings in a carpetbag suitcase. You can actually see an example of this in two of the men who were riding in a carriage in the film Gone with the Wind. And they are presented as carpetbaggers. There's actually several references to carpetbaggers in the sections of Gone with the Wind that I'd like for you to watch. And so all of these Northerners coming from the North and coming down and in descending upon the South from the Southerners' point of view and throwing all their clothes and belongings into these carpet bag suitcases and coming down south and rushing in hopes of finding economic opportunity and political power and personal power. And they were seen also by white Southerners as being very unscrupulous, very unethical, which is not entirely true. That there were some who were attempting to make personal gain out of the travails of Reconstruction and out of the period of the South reconstructing itself. But many of them were actually businessmen, teachers, people who wanted to modernize the South, there also were preachers who came from the North down to the South who were sort of driven by a missionary Christian impulse to improve the South. So even though white Southerners tended to look both upon scalawags and carpetbaggers with derision, with hatred, with negativity, some of the carpetbaggers actually were trying to create change for the better, and weren't only about personal gain or personal profit, even though of course some of them were as well. Okay, so those are two terms that you need to be familiar with from the Reconstruction period: the scalawag, those white Southerners who were sympathetic to the North and to the Union, and then of course the carpetbaggers, who were these Northerners who came down from the North and were seen as being these sort of unscrupulous and people who were taking advantage of the South during this difficult time of Reconstruction. Okay, all right, let's get to the last slide here, talking about Reconstruction. And that is getting into 1876 and 1877, and the election of 1876 leads us into what becomes known as the Compromise of 1877, which is the period and the event that ends the period of that historians refer to as Reconstruction. You can see here, this is a political cartoon referencing the election of 1876 and the presidential election between the two candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the candidate from the Republican Party from Ohio, and Samuel Tilden, who was the Democratic candidate from New York State. And this fits into a lot of the themes of the period of the late 1870s, of this period moving into what is known as the Gilded Age and the late Reconstruction period, this period of corruption, this period of scandal, this period of economic crisis. And this was not the best time to be dealing with some really complex political and social and economic issues, which the United States was struggling with in this late period of Reconstruction. And it all comes to a head. It all kind of coalesces into this election in 1876 between the Democrat Tilden and the Republican Hayes. And the election went forward. It was very contested. Hayes had been a governor from Ohio. Samuel Tilden was a famous lawyer from New York State. And after the election takes place, and on election day in the fall of 1876 in November, it's so close, they cannot tell who's going to be victorious. There is an electoral deadlock in terms of the Electoral College votes. And Sam Tilden actually had 184 electoral votes, and he only needed one more vote. In this election, there was needed 185 electoral votes to become president. He had 184, and he had won the popular vote by more than 300,000 more votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. But there, since he was one elector short, there were still 3 or 4 states where there were irregular returns, and it was not certain who actually had won that state. And there were 4 states left: Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And the voting was so close, and there was scandal and uncertainty about voting irregularities. And all of those states had to go in the Republican direction for the Republican candidate Hayes to win. All Tilden had to do was to win one of those states, and he would win the election and go over the threshold for the 185 electoral votes. there was nothing in the Constitution to deal with the situation when you had a series of states who weren't certain who had actually won their own election in their respective state. And so in January of 1877, 2 months after the election, it was still not clear who had won. And the Congress, the Federal Congress, set up a special electoral commission consisting of 15 men from the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court. So from the legislative branch and from the judicial branch of the American government to decide this election from the executive branch, right? And all of those were... there was all sorts of debates and discussions amongst the 15 members. 8 of them were Republicans, 7 of them were Democrats, and they voted to have to decide that all of those 4 remaining states, Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, would be given to Hayes, and the presidency would stay in the hands of the Republican Party because, of course, Ulysses Grant had been a Republican and Hayes was running as a Republican. And there's a series of deliberations, and the House of Representatives agrees to the commission's decision to give all 4 of those states over to the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Hayes would win the election, even though it's probably very clear from the historical record, and historians have studied this election quite a bit, that Tilden really should have won the election. He definitely won the popular vote, and he probably should have won several of those states, if not all of them, even though he ended up losing those 4 states of Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So there's all sorts of discussion. The Democrats flip out. They did not want to lose another election to the presidency because they had lost several in a row. And there all sorts of things begin to happen behind closed doors in the halls of Congress, and discussions between Southern Democrats and Republicans. And this is what brings up what becomes known as the Compromise of 1877 that comes out of the election of 1876, the presidential election of 76. And in this compromise, the Republican candidate would win and the Democrats would accept it. But there were a series of conditions that the Democrats from the South pushed forward and said that the Republican Party had to agree to. And one of the most important of these was that if Hayes won the election and the Republicans went back into power in the executive branch, that the federal government, the former Union troops, and the military presence in those military districts in the South would be removed. And the last of the federal troops, the U.S. troops that had been stationed in the South since the end of the Civil War for over 12 years, they would be removed. And what eventually would come out of that, of course, was that their attempt to make sure that elections were fair, to make sure that things were running smoothly in the South in this period of Reconstruction, that would fall apart. And that most certainly meant that all of the Republican Reconstruction governments would collapse and fall and go over to the Democratic side once they could not ensure that elections were being fair and there wasn't intimidation and that the 14th and 15th Amendment were not being respected. And so all sorts of issues related to that. There also was another part of the compromise that said the Republicans had to support a bill that would subsidize construction of a southern railroad, of a southern transcontinental railroad as well. They also agreed that they would give one cabinet position in Hayes's cabinet, the officials that, advise the presidents, from the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and all of those very prominent prominent positions. One of them would be given to a Southern white Democrat. They decided they would give it to the least powerful position in the cabinet, which was the Postmaster General, the person who's partly in charge of the post office. But that was what took place. The compromise is finished. And so Hayes is in office, but most importantly, the military is out of the South. And now, effectively, what happens is that white rule, white power, and white political rule reemerges in the South. Very, very important. And this is why scholars usually refer to this period of Reconstruction as being a failure, because what ends up happening is that Republicans quietly gave up their fight for racial equality in the South, and for black rights and for African American rights in the South. And in 1877, one of the first things that Rutherford B. Hayes does as president is withdraw the last federal troops from the South after he becomes president. There's Republican governments that had power in the reconstructed South collapse, and Reconstruction is over. And it is over along the terms of that all of the hopes and intentions for civil rights that African Americans had after the end of slavery and after the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, they were all pretty much null and void. And what happens is that Reconstruction ends up failing, and these three amendments, these Reconstruction amendments, are not able to be enforced, particularly the 14th and the 15th one, are not able to be enforced in ways that was the intention of those who actually passed those amendments to the Constitution. And so this is why scholars usually refer to that Reconstruction is an overall failure. And what it begins, of course, is a period of about 80 to 90 years where African Americans are again pushed back into second-class status, particularly in the American South. And we see the creation of two types of new laws and codes that come forward. One of them is known as the Black Codes. And then, of course, Jim Crow laws, which were a series of laws passed state by state between the 1870s, late 1870s, and the 1890s, which basically which reversed all the provisions of the 14th and 15th Amendments particularly, and created a very ugly, uncertain, and violent and discriminatory experience for African Americans in the South, for most racial minorities, but particularly for African Americans moving forward. And what this suggests, and this is a very important part of this lecture, is this idea that scholars for a very long time in many in the academy, when the historical academy, people who study the past, scholars in academe, they had argued for a long time that history was about progress, and that history was about this thing called a teleology, a historical teleology. And I'm talking now about this concept here. And what this example of Reconstruction shows, and the ways that it failed, is that that those scholars who had argued for many years, going back into the 17th century, these English historians who studied English history, and then forward into the 18th and 19th century with German and American scholars, and all these different scholars in the Western world had made these arguments that history is about progress, and history is about moving forward, and history is this linear movement towards equality and for the betterment of humankind. And then the further you go back in the past, people had less rights, going back to the medieval period and slavery and serfdom and peasantry and all that stuff. And as we get closer to the modern period in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, more and more people are getting rights, and the world is more equal, and we're progressing forward. And that whole idea is this historical teleology, that history is a teleology of progress. And what scholars, of course, realized was that history is not always progressing. And the events of Reconstruction make that very clear, because for a short period of time, African Americans had civil rights. They were protected under the law, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendments. And then after the end of the Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction, they are pushed back, and they have their rights are regressed, and they are not able to get civil rights, of course, for 80 to 90 years forward until we get into the 1950s and 60s and early 1970s. And so what Reconstruction thus shows, as scholars have now argued in the last 50 to 60 years, is that history is not always moving forward. History is not a story of teleology. The teleology is false. Teleology is the idea that history is always progressing and moving forward, and that is not true. And many scholars have been able to make that point in studying this example of Reconstruction. Okay, so the historical teleology idea is false, and Reconstruction as a historical event establishes that. And therefore, of course, this is a profoundly sad and poignant moment in U.S. history. It's just a very difficult and upsetting moment because, of course, some of the hopes and dreams, many of the hopes and dreams and aspirations for equality and for true civic liberty for human beings after the end of the American Civil War are not able to become a reality, or not able to come to fruition. And that, of course, is going to lead into the late 19th and 20th century, where we have segregation, where we have this concept of separate but equal, which, of course, was not equal, and that was inscribed in Supreme Court law. And it's going to, of course, be 70 to 80 years until we get to the 1950s with Brown versus the Board of Education. And a variety of other court cases, and then, of course, the civil rights legislation and movement in the 50s and 60s for a variety of ethnic and racial groups, but particularly for African Americans, that is going to eventually overcome this failure of Reconstruction. Okay, so that's some of this stuff about, and I make this point, and I'll make this point in several lectures going forward, that there are, one of the things that we're trying to get at in studying American history, particularly at the college level, is to not make the history of the United States be this triumphant story that's always good and good overcoming evil, and this story of exceptionalism, and the U.S. is by far the greatest country in the world and has all these opportunities and just this amazing historical narrative, because that's not true. Also, we're trying to see that there, of course, are moments of true movement forward and the creation of a history and the historical events that do allow for ideas of equality and do allow for opportunity and some of the more positive things in U.S. history. And so what we're trying to get at here is the complexity of U.S. history. I think if you think of U.S. history as only being one of beauty and of success and of this exceptional, story of American promise and American greatness, that's completely false, and that's very problematic. And anyone who makes that argument has not really studied history to the extent that one should. But on the other side too, of course, there are many really poignant and beautiful and powerful moments of nobility in U.S. history too. We also need to mention, some of them. And so that balance of seeing the complexity of some of the good moments of U.S. history and some of the movements forward and some of the movements where liberty was established and opportunity was established, and then, of course, some of the really serious complexities on issues, ranging from, race and ethnicity to class and economic opportunity, on issues of gender, all sorts of issues where the U.S. has fallen short and perhaps continues to fall short. We also need to examine those as well. So seeing that complexity of U.S. history and really trying to look for that gray and look for the sort of really nuanced understanding of both the, quote, good and the bad of U.S. history is what we're ascribing to. And by looking at Reconstruction, we can begin that interrogation and begin that understanding of that narrative. All right, all set for now, and we'll stop here.